My name is Slava. I'm one of the founders at RethinkDB. Thank you guys very much for coming. All right, so I did a talk on what's coming in RethinkDB in 2015, and when I was preparing for this talk, I thought, okay, as like a man of reason, I'm going to look back at what I said in 2015, a year ago, and figure out if we've actually done any of the things we did. Because if we did like this, I can tell you more about what's happening in 2016, and if we didn't, then I probably shouldn't be here. So I did watch the video, all 40 minutes of it, of myself speaking a year ago about the plans for 2015. And we actually had like a 1.0 batting average. We did all the things I talked about. So this is credible. Like all the stuff I'm going to talk about today is actually going to happen. All right, so just by show of hands, how many people have never used RethinkDB before or don't know what it is? Okay, cool, a couple of people. I'm going to do a quick intro and then talk about what we did last year a little bit, and then talk about some really exciting stuff we're working on that's going to be released in a couple of months. So just to give you an intro to RethinkDB, RethinkDB is a distributed NoSQL database. It's similar to Mongo if you've used something like that before, in that you can store and retrieve JSON documents, and you can scale it out to multiple machines. But that's pretty much where the similarity ends. What's special and unique about RethinkDB that you can't get anywhere else is a notion of change feeds. RethinkDB is designed for real-time applications. And basically what that means is the world is really changing and technology is moving into the direction of real-time, where instead of polling for data and showing it to the user, data gets pushed to the client. So for example, 5 years ago, you'd go to a website, you'd get the information, you'd see the data, and then if you wanted to see something new, you'd have to refresh. And that's the way things just generally work. Today, if you look at all the popular apps, the way that work, you go to the website, and then whenever something changes, you generally just see an update right away. So an example of this, a couple of examples is Slack, if you ever used it, so messaging. You see it on Facebook. You see it in multiplayer games, like when a character moves, everything around them moves. You see it in real-time analytics, like moving graphs, things like that. And the general idea is that the data just gets pushed to the client. So the reason why we started the company and why traditional databases don't do this well is that in a traditional database, it's really built around like the idea of request-response. So you send a query, you get a response. If you want an update, you have to send another query. And you can build real-time applications this way. Like, for example, you can just poll the database every 5 milliseconds, and it will work fine at the beginning. But when you look at building these apps at scale, what ends up happening is as you get more users and every client starts pinging the database, it really brings the database down, because traditionally databases aren't designed to be polled like on 5 or 10 millisecond basis. And what happens in practice is as people start growing and scaling these apps as they get more complex, the infrastructure to work around these limitations becomes really, really sophisticated. You need a lot of moving pieces. You need to deal with a lot of moving pieces. You need to write really complicated code. Like, things just get really hard. And that's the problem RethinkDB is designed to solve. So I'm going to do maybe a little bit of a demo of RethinkDB as it is now, and then we'll talk about the new things that we're doing. For those of you who've seen it before, like, I'm going to try to do it really fast, so you hopefully don't get bored. All right, so I'm going to start the RethinkDB server. It's just a process. You type RethinkDB on the command line. This spins up the database, pretty similar to any other database you've used before. And one unique feature of RethinkDB is it comes with a built-in admin console. It's exposed on port 8080, so what you can do is you can just open the browser, point it at localhost 8080, and you'll be able to write queries and do things like that. So let's do that now. All right, so we're in our admin console, and I'm going to go to what we call a data explorer. And the data explorer is just a way to write queries, kind of experiment with queries, and just play with RethinkDB. And when you start developing an application, you can start testing things out. So I'm just going to show you just the basics of how RethinkDB works, a couple of basic things, and then we'll move on. So the first thing you typically do in RethinkDB, same thing as in any other database, you say you have to create a table. And a table is just a collection of data. So you can have tables like users, accounts, things like that. You do it by using command table create. I'm going to zoom in a little more so you can see this. So you see I'm starting with this thing called r dot. R is just a package. All the RethinkDB commands are in that package. The queries I'm going to write here are literally JavaScript. So if you're writing a Node.js application, you can take this, copy paste it into your Node.js app, and everything will still work. And you can use any other language like Python, Ruby. There are drivers for pretty much anything now. And the language is very, very similar in most drivers. So I'm going to create a table, let's say users. And it already exists. I'll do users 1. OK, so we've created a table. And you can see everything in RethinkDB is a JSON document. So the return here, the result set here is a JSON document that describes the table. Right now, it's just my laptop, but it will tell you like which machines it's on if you're in a cluster. It will tell you the name, the ID of the table, just things like that. And then what you can do is you can insert documents, and you can do queries. So let's insert something. I'm going to insert a document, something like name, Slava. And if I look at the result, it said, OK, we inserted one document here. So everything you insert is just JSON. It's a little bit extended. So you can insert more stuff. For example, binary files. You can do geospatial data. You could do timestamps, which is surprisingly hard in JavaScript. But basically, like for the purposes of this, you can just think of it as JSON. So I inserted one document. I'm going to insert another one. Let's call it Bob. Again, it's there. And then I'm going to run a query just to get these back. And I just got the documents back that I put in. Now, you can so RethinkDB comes with what we call REQL, which is a very flexible query language. You could write queries to do pretty much anything. You could do joins, even in clusters. You could do subqueries. I'm just going to do something really simple. I'm going to filter my documents and get just Bob back. So I do it like this. OK, now we got one document back. So I'm not going to get too deep into how RethinkDB works, because there's a lot of people here who are familiar with it. But you can go to rethinkdb.com. There are really good docs. You can get started very easily. And it's just a very convenient general-purpose database. It scales really well. And it's particularly good for real-time stuff. So I'm not going to actually demo the real-time stuff right now, but I'll demo the new stuff we're working on. And you'll kind of see a little bit about how this works. OK, so let's talk a little bit about what we did last year, just to give you some idea of what I talked about. So yes, I can like kind of build up the credibility that we've actually built all this stuff, and the stuff I'm talking about today is real. So the things we were going to do when we talked about it last year, RethinkDB was in beta. We wanted to ship a production version of the product, ship client services, like paid services, so real companies can use the product, pay for it, and just get the services they need to get up to speed and get to scale. We were going to build all the real-time functionality. So that was new. That only happened last year in 2015. And we're very excited about it because the real-time stuff really drove the growth of the product. We were going to build what we call cluster management and statistics API. So the challenge was that you could scale up the RethinkDB up to multiple machines and multiple data centers. But then when people ran it at scale, they realized that it wasn't scriptable. Everything had to be done manually. And we had some scripting provisions that weren't really that great. And then when they monitored their running clusters, things were just hard because there was no good API to figure out what's going on. So that was a big, big feature that we wanted to build, and we did. And it basically gives you a programmatic API to do cluster management and monitoring, and it works through REQL. So for people who are familiar with the query language, they can just write queries that say something like move data from this machine to this machine, and everything will just work. And then you can monitor what's going on. We were adding asynchronous support to languages beyond JavaScript. And this is actually surprisingly hard because JavaScript is built to be asynchronous and real-time by default, whereas something like Python is not. It's blocking. And Python has a lot of asynchronous libraries, but integrating with them was pretty challenging. So that was a big thing we wanted to do, integrate asynchronous support and change feed support into the Python driver. That happened. And we wanted to ship a Java driver, which actually finally happened. People have been waiting for it for a long time. And Josh over there, hi Josh, actually did all that work. So yeah, so all of that is out. It was out last year. It's very, very exciting because when we did this talk a year ago, we had 25,000 developers building apps on top of RethinkDB. Right now, it's 110,000, so it grew by more than 4x. And a lot of the growth has been driven by the real-time features and a lot of these other features that I've been talking about. Okay, so let's talk. So this is all in the past, and it's really exciting, but it's done. So what I'd like to talk about now is what's coming for RethinkDB this year in 2016. So just, I guess, to get this started, so I show you how to build queries. We're doing this in the console here, but if you're building a real app, generally the way you'd build an app in RethinkDB is you do it very similarly to how you do it in any other database. Like you've got your database that you start, then you have your backend, which is Node.js or Python or Rails or whatever it is. So you build your backend, and then you build your front-end app. And when we would explain the real-time features to people, we'd say, okay, the way RethinkDB works is that it pushes data out to the client. People will often say, well, how do I access it from the browser, right? How do I write queries in the browser and get the data in? And initially, the way we interpret, like traditionally, you wouldn't want to expose the database directly to the internet because it has huge security risks, denial of service attack risks, just all kinds of problems. Like you'd always build middleware on top of it, like build backend code on top of it. So initially, when people started asking how they access it from the browser, we just kind of maybe dismissed this question a little bit, and we were like, okay, well, you build the middleware, you have to download Node.js or Python and kind of learn how to build web apps. But then the questions just kept coming and coming and coming, and people kept asking the same question over and over again. How do I access this from the browser? And eventually, once we got like hundreds of these, we kind of sat back and we said, okay, maybe access from the browser is not that bad an idea, and we should think about it a little bit. Does this make sense so far, by the way? Yeah? Okay, cool. And so, okay, so we thought about this problem, like why are people asking this question? And I think, like the way we interpreted it originally, we were looking at what people were trying to do from the perspective of database developers. Like you've got this database, okay, you want to build your app, well, you build a back end and then you build your front end in like React or Angular or whatever. But if you're actually building apps every day, then your world looks, it's very, very different. Like you just want to build, you're working in Angular, you're working in React, you're building your app, but to get started, you kind of have to do a lot of boilerplate work. Like you have to download all the Node.js libraries. If you're not familiar with the stuff, you have to learn how to use Express or Koa or one of the middleware libraries or frameworks. Then as you build your app, you have to create endpoints, you have to write database queries. It's kind of a lot of work for an app developer. And what a lot of people want to do is they just want to build their application. They don't want to worry about all of that like backend and database stuff. And I think that question of how to access RethinkDB from the browser kind of came from the point of view of, I just want to get started with my app, like why do I have to do all this stuff? Wouldn't it be great if I didn't have to? And when we thought about it, we decided to build a new project on top of RethinkDB, currently codenamed Fusion, which is a terrible name because there's like 50 companies called Fusion. That's going to change. But we don't have a name yet, so I'm just going to keep calling it that for now. And the idea behind Fusion is that it's a layer on top of RethinkDB that will give people a complete backend where they can just build their apps and not worry about any of the backend stuff, at least initially. And this is what I want to demo to you today. So Fusion is really, really cool because once we got it working, I realized, like, man, I used to build apps without it, but now that I have this is so cool because I don't have to set up anything. I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. It just lets me do basically what I want to get done, which is build my app. And if you guys are familiar with Firebase, one way you can think about Fusion is kind of a self-hosted open source Firebase that you can download to your laptop, run it on your laptop, and then you can deploy it however you want because it's all open source components. Does that make sense? OK, so I'd like to show you a demo of Fusion now to give you an idea of how that stuff works. So let's go back to the terminal here. All right, so I'm on a development branch right now. This is all shipping in about maybe 2 months or so. So if stuff breaks, sorry, but hopefully it doesn't. And things are going to look a little bit weird, like it's possible that we're going to change APIs a little bit and things like that. So I'm going to start the Fusion server. Right now I just have a script called serve.js that spins everything up, hopefully. OK, yep, it spins everything up. And what this does is it spins up RethinkDB, and then it spins up Fusion server that runs on top of it that connects to the database. Now, what the Fusion server does, it exposes a WebSocket protocol that the browsers can connect to directly. So now if you're building an app, you can just build your front end, and you don't have to worry, and you can use the Fusion API, and you don't have to worry about doing any of the backend stuff. So I have a file here. Sorry, give me 1 second. Can you guys see this? Is this good? OK, so I just created a basic demo, like index.html. It doesn't use any frameworks. We're just going to write some code in the browser console. But what this does is it basically sets up Fusion on the client. So this is what you'd put in your app. And it's relatively simple. So it imports observables. We actually probably don't need this for this demo. It imports the Fusion client library that runs in the browser and gives you the APIs you need to start building your apps, and just sets up a connection. So if you're building a React app or Angular app, this is just the setup code you need, and then after that you can start writing, you can start building your app. So what I'm going to do now is spin up just an HTTP server that hosts this file, and then we're going to go to localhost 8000. I think it's /demo. No. OK, yeah, localhost 8000. So this is our little app. And what we can do now is start using the Fusion API. Does this make sense so far? Everyone kind of follows? OK. Is this better? Can you see this? OK, cool. So what I'm going to write in the console here is basically JavaScript. But this is exactly the code you'd write if you wanted to create your app. So Fusion is a variable that gives you access to the Fusion client library. And the way it works is you first access a table or a collection of documents. So for example, let's say we wanted to have a set of documents called users, and we wanted to insert a document. So the Fusion API for this in the browser is fusion.store, and I'm going to store like name, Michael. I'm going to run this. And this command, so you type this in the browser, and if this works, which we're going to check this out in a second, this document named Michael should actually show up in the database, should show up in RethinkDB. So I'm going to go back to my data explorer here. And run a query table users, and hopefully, oh, right, I need the database Fusion. So I'm going to say db Fusion. And our document shows up. So if you're paying attention, like we didn't have to set up Express. We didn't have to set up Node.js. We didn't have to do any of the stuff. We just start the Fusion server, and then on the client, you get a data API that lets you store documents straight into the database and get them back. So let's try to get this back in the browser. So I think the way that works, I haven't actually used this in a while. All right, console.log x. And we get our object back. All right, so this is a basic API. What this lets you do is store documents, retrieve them without writing any backend code. Now what I'd like to do is show you the real-time capabilities of this. And this is really, really cool because it makes it very easy to build real-time apps. And the idea behind Fusion is that it's all real-time by default. So whenever you have a multi-user environment, like if you're writing a game where you have multiple clients, anytime one client writes to the database, another client can subscribe to the data that client is interested in, and then everything updates in real time. So the way this API works is I say, so instead of value, I'll say subscribe. And the subscribe API right now is just basically you pass it a bunch of callbacks, and whenever something changes on the database level, everything propagates all the way up through the stack, and you get your data. So let's say we want to subscribe to events whenever a document is added. So I'm going to say on added, and then do the same thing, just x console.log x. I hope this is right. So we get the first document by default. So now let's try something interesting. We're going to go in a different browser window into Data Explorer and insert a new document into this table. So I'm going to insert another document, name Ryan. So I'm going to run this query. The document's inserted. And what you see happened here on the left is right away this document shows up in the console. This is really, really cool because you get a complete communication stack. It's completely event-driven between the browser and the database without doing any extra work at all. And all of this is open source. So you can download this on your laptop. You can build your apps. You can deploy it however you want. You're not kind of stuck to a particular cloud provider. You're not stuck to a particular API. Now, what's really unique about Fusion relative to something like Firebase, other than the cloud stuff, is that Fusion is extensible. So if you're using Firebase, you get your API that's pretty similar to this, actually, right? Like you can store data, you can retrieve it, you can do some basic filters and basic queries. But then what happens when your app grows and it becomes more sophisticated and you want to do more stuff, you kind of grow out of Firebase, right? Like you can't use it anymore because you need functionality that Firebase doesn't give you. And then what ends up happening is people do super complicated things, like they replicate between Firebase and something else, like MongoDB, and then they have to sync the data, and then eventually they realize it's more trouble than it's worth, and they just switch off. What's cool about Fusion is because everything's open and it's a complete stack, is that you can start using the Fusion server, and then once your app gets more complicated, you have complete access to RethinkDB. So you actually have a full database designed for real time on the bottom of the stack that you can essentially extend your app and start accessing when things get complicated. And the way the Fusion server is designed is once your app kind of outgrows the basic functionality, you can import it into Node.js, and it integrates with Koa and Express and Hoppy, and you can build your app the way you normally would, except it gives you this API and does all the setup and boilerplate. So you can write your app without worrying about dealing with all the challenges of the WebSocket protocol and all the distributed systems problems, and just tons of challenges involved in building apps like this. Like you basically don't have to roll your own Firebase, it's just there for you. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So I want to talk a little bit more about Fusion and what it gives you. So it is basically designed, so by the way, Fusion right now is not open because it's still in development. We're working with a lot of users that kind of expressed interest. So it's a private GitHub project. Just because, like, when you're first designing a product, too many voices can kind of spoil the design process. But if you guys are interested, please shoot me an email at slava@rethinkdb.com, and I'll just add you to the GitHub project. So this is what I'm looking at here. And it's essentially two things. It's a server that you can just start up or import into your Node.js project that deals with all the boilerplate. And it's a client library that integrates with Angular or React or Polymer or any other library you might want to use on the front end. And lets you seamlessly do this client-server communication. And part of kind of the idea behind Fusion is that it will include all kinds of basic services that you need as a web developer. So stuff like sessions, persistence, which I showed you, geolocation stuff, authentication, security, all these things. So as you start building your app, you can get up to speed very, very quickly. And then as things get more progressively complicated, the idea behind Fusion is that there's an upgrade path, and apps can get progressively more complicated. So that's the first thing we're working on. We're very excited about it because I think it will make the lives of web developers dramatically easier. And the second project related to this is what we're currently calling Fusion Apps. And the idea is, okay, I built my Fusion app. I want to get it on the internet. Like, I want to deploy it. I want to show it to my friends or my colleagues. Maybe I want to use it for a hackathon. How do I do that? Well, because everything is open source, you could just deploy it yourself. Like, you could deploy RethinkDB in Fusion on AWS or Rackspace or Google Cloud or whatever, whatever cloud provider you want, Linode. But if you're actually doing this at scale, like doing this deployment yourself is kind of a pain, because there are a lot of challenges. You have to figure out how to scale out the database, and with Rethink it's pretty easy, but there's still a lot of operational challenges involved. You have to do backups, you have to do all kinds of things that people normally don't want to think about. And the idea behind Fusion Apps is that it's a cloud service that's going to let people essentially type Fusion deploy and get their app online, and then scale it up or down, and everything will be managed, so people don't have to worry about it. And I think what's really compelling about it is that you can do it yourself. You don't need Fusion Apps, like you don't have to worry about all the cloud stuff. But if you want it, Fusion Apps will be there for you, and it's very, very compelling because you could just get your app deployed with literally zero effort. All right, do you guys have any questions?